The Ashcroft demonstration floor had been trying to start the prototype for 11 minutes, and the silence from the engine bay had shifted from awkward to catastrophic. Reed Callahan stood at the edge of the room in a delivery uniform, waiting on a clerk. Vivian Ashcroft, 33. Dark blazer. The bearing of a woman who had never had to ask twice stepped forward. Her gaze landed on Reed. She said it loudly enough that the lapel mic caught it. "Start the engine and I'll date you." The room laughed. Reed set his clipboard down and walked toward the car. What he did next, no one in that room expected. Reed Callahan was 38 years old, and he lived in a narrow 2-story house in Portland, Oregon, where the gutters needed cleaning, and the third stair from the bottom made a sound he kept meaning to fix. He made coffee each morning in a percolator his wife had bought at an estate sale, and he poured 1 cup and set the pot back on the burner out of habit. The way you preserve a ritual even after its original reason is gone. His daughter Wren was 7 years old, and she slept with the focused intensity of someone completing an important task. On the morning he drove to Ashcroft, she came downstairs early and sat across from him at the kitchen table. She had her mother's way of looking at people directly. "Bah," she said, which was what she called him when she was being serious. "Why don't you work at a big company anymore?" Reed looked at his coffee. "The company I worked for closed down." She accepted this the way she accepted most of his incomplete answers. Not with the satisfaction of a child who believes it, but with the patience of one who has learned that some doors don't open when you knock on them. Pete Granger had known Reed since they were both 22 and failing thermodynamics at Oregon State. Pete was 55 with bad knees and an encyclopedic knowledge of every domestic engine built between 1978 and the present. He was also the kind of man who understood that some people carry things that are not yours to ask about. When Reed had shown up at his garage 3 years ago with a duffel bag and a face that had been through something Pete could not name, Pete had handed him a wrench and showed him where the coffee was. That was the entirety of the conversation. In 3 years, neither of them had found a reason to revisit it. The delivery order came in on a Tuesday. Specialized brake components, custom fitted. Consigned to the Ashcroft Motor Group receiving dock. Pete pulled the order off the printer and handed it to Reed without looking up. Reed read the address. Set the paper down. Picked it up again. "I'll take it," he said. Pete looked up then. He looked at Reed for a long moment, and then he looked back down at the carburetor. "All right," he said. Reed drove north across the city with the box in the back of the van and the radio off. When he pulled into the Ashcroft complex and saw the sign above the entrance, he read the tagline beneath the company name. Built on the legacy of safety. He sat in the parked van for a while after he turned the engine off. Then he got out and walked in. Across town that same morning, Vivian Ashcroft was in conference room B, listening to her lead engineer explain why the prototype had failed its cold start diagnostic for the 3rd consecutive day. Grant Holloway sat at the end of the table with his hands flat on the surface, his expression arranged into steady confidence. "I'll handle it before the demo," he said. "You focus on the investors." Vivian had nodded. She had asked, "You're certain?" Grant had smiled. "Have you ever seen me not be?" It was the answer she had been receiving from Grant for 4 years, and every time it had turned out to be sufficient. She went to greet the investors. She did not think about the conversation again until the prototype refused to start in front of 40 people, and she was standing in a room that was beginning to understand that something had gone very wrong. Reed reached the prototype and crouched beside the front quarter panel. The senior technician moved to stop him. Reed raised one hand without looking up. "Don't touch the auxiliary relay." Something in the flatness of his voice stopped the technician mid-step. At the far wall, Grant Holloway had gone very still. Not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of recognition. What followed took fewer than 90 seconds, but it saved Vivian Ashcroft's morning. The engine turned over. The prototype came alive with the smooth, low purr of a properly tuned 6-cylinder, and the room reset itself into approval applause, a few cautious laughs. The European investors leaning forward again. Vivian permitted herself one small exhale. Grant Holloway moved before anyone else could think. He stepped to the platform, addressed the investors directly, and reframed the entire incident as a controlled stress test of the company's response protocol. The prototype's design, he said, had performed exactly as intended under simulated field conditions. He invited a round of applause for the technical team. He got it. By the time the room was clearing, Vivian's assistant had already drafted a release waiver. Reed was asked to sign a brief acknowledgement that his unscheduled technical intervention had occurred under emergency conditions and posed no liability to the Ashcroft Group. He read it. He understood, immediately, that the document protected the company, not him. He signed anyway. He did not need a quarrel he could not afford. He had picked up his clipboard and was crossing toward the exit when Grant Holloway stepped into his path. They were close enough that no one else would hear. Grant's face had the composed surface of a man who had spent a long career in rooms where speaking carefully was the difference between safe and not. "You shouldn't be here," Grant said. "I'm making a delivery. Don't come back." It was not a request. It was the voice Grant had used 8 years ago when he had explained, in the same low register, what would happen to a junior safety engineer's career and family if certain reports were filed without first being reviewed by the technical division. Reed looked at him directly. For the first time since the day he had been walked out of this building, he was standing in the same air as Grant Holloway, and he did not lower his eyes. "I heard you the first time," Reed said. He kept walking. Grant watched him go. He waited until Reed was through the doors. Then he took out his phone and made a call. The conversation lasted under 30 seconds. When it was over, Grant returned to the floor, smiling, shaking the right hands, the picture of a man whose morning had gone exactly as he had planned. Vivian had seen the exchange between Grant and the delivery driver from across the room. She had not heard the words, but she had read the geometry of two men standing too close. And she had registered something in Grant's face that she did not, in the moment, have a name for. She filed it away. By the end of the afternoon, she had nearly forgotten it. Nearly. That evening, Wren set a model engine on the kitchen table, a scaled-down Vate she had assembled from a kit. She showed Reed a problem in the valve intake assembly, describing it not as a problem, but as a thing that did not sit right. Reed leaned over and placed one finger on the exact piece she had been unable to locate. She looked at his finger, then at him. "How did you know which one?" Reed said. "Because it's the only one that's fighting you." She thought about that and turned back to fix it. Reed got up, opened the kitchen drawer, looked at the padded envelope inside, and closed it again. The public humiliation came 4 days later. And it came the way they always do, not because anyone planned it exactly, but because a series of small decisions accumulated into something that couldn't be taken back. The Ashcroft Group had sent a formal notice of return on the delivered components, citing a quality discrepancy in the brake specifications. The documentation was detailed and official and entirely incorrect. Pete received it Thursday morning and called Reed, his voice doing the thing it did when he was trying to be calm and failing. Under the supply contract, any quality dispute could be addressed through direct mediation at the receiving facility within 72 hours. Reed had the contract folded in his jacket pocket when he drove to Ashcroft that afternoon. What he had not accounted for was the media event. Vivian was hosting a press reception in the main atrium near the garage bay. There were journalists, a documentary camera crew, and industry partners arranged around the newly unveiled production logo for the next generation Ashcroft line. Reed stood at the reception counter and waited for the warehouse supervisor. A young woman in a headset told him the vendor entrance was on the other side of the building. Reed explained he had a contractual right to in-person mediation and showed her the relevant clause. She did not read it. She called a security officer. By the time Vivian came through the corridor to see what was causing the delay, there were 2 people in a standoff at the reception desk. The camera crew had half turned toward the disturbance, and journalists were watching with the attention of people who recognize a story beginning to take shape. Vivian read the situation in approximately 2 seconds and made the wrong decision. "Sir." Her voice was clear and carrying. "This reception isn't open to vendors. The delivery entrance is on the east side." She did not ask what he was there for. She did not look at the document he was holding. A journalist made a sound that was almost a laugh. A photographer captured the frame. Reed looked at Vivian Ashcroft for a long moment. Not with anger, not with humiliation, with the specific quality of attention of a man who was recording something carefully for future reference. Then he folded the contract, put it back in his pocket, and walked to the exit. Ren was in the van. She had been reading, bent over her book at the angle she used when trying to finish a chapter before being interrupted. She looked up when Reed got in. She waited until they had driven 3 blocks. Then, "They don't know who you are, do they?" "No," Reed said. She turned back to her book. She did not turn any more pages for the rest of the drive home. Dana Cho had covered the automotive industry for 6 years, first for a trade publication in Detroit, and then for a Pacific Northwest business journal that cared more about narrative than spec sheets. She had been at the Ashcroft reception for a profile on Vivian, and she had watched the exchange at the reception desk with the professional instinct of someone trained to notice what other people dismiss. There was something in the face of the man in the delivery uniform that did not match the uniform. On the car ride back to her office, she pulled up the Ashcroft Technical Archives and began looking at engineering credits on older documentation. She found a name. She read it twice. She sat with her tablet in her lap for the remainder of the ride and did not speak. 5 days after the reception, Pete called Reed at 8 in the morning, and the sound of his voice was enough. He had run into a man named Terry Okafor at a bar the night before, a former Ashcroft technician who'd had 3 beers and talked about the prototype problem. With the exhaustion of someone no longer required to be discreet, the heat cycling anomaly on the 3rd coolant loop, he'd said. Temperature spikes on the 4th lap of any sustained run. 3 days of diagnostics and the team couldn't locate the root cause. Grant had locked down the data. Pete relayed all of this the next morning, not thinking much of it. Reed listened without speaking. When Pete finished, Reed asked, "Which lap did the temperature spike?" "The 4th. "Why?" "Just asking," Reed said. He was not just asking. He knew exactly what a 4th lap heat spike on the 3rd coolant loop meant in the Ashcroft GT series architecture, because he had written the thermal load specifications for that architecture 8 years ago. He had also flagged a design vulnerability in the original loop configuration during the safety review, and had been told the issue was corrected before production. He had never been able to verify that, because 6 weeks after filing the flag, he had been handed an NDA and a termination notice. That evening, he opened his laptop to an engineering credentials account he had not accessed in 3 years, pulled up the original thermal design schematics, and worked through the math on paper. 3 pages of dense calculation. At the end, the numbers were exactly what he had expected. The flaw had never been corrected. It had simply been buried. He thought about the NDA, about Clause 7, about Ren. He drafted the email 4 times. The 4th version was 3 paragraphs. Location of the fault, thermal threshold at failure, temporary mitigation for the coolant loop sufficient to prevent catastrophic failure during the next test run. He did not sign it. He sent it from a temporary address at 11:47 that night. Ren came downstairs at midnight for a glass of water and found him at the kitchen table. "Are you solving something?" she asked. "Working on it. Is it the hard kind or the long kind?" Reed thought about that. "Both," he said. She filled her glass and went back upstairs. In his office on the 6th floor, Grant Holloway received the anonymous advisory at 7 the following morning. He read it once, set his phone face down, read it again. The precision was not accidental. This was someone who knew the original design from the inside. He picked up his phone and called his attorney. The test run happened 4 days later. Grant had implemented the patch from the anonymous advisory quietly, without telling his engineering team the source. He believed it was enough. It was not enough. Marco Vega was 26 years old and had been driving for the Ashcroft development program for 18 months. He was not afraid of speed. He was afraid, in the specific technical way of experienced test drivers, of losing control at high speed without warning. Because control was the thing you trained to maintain, and losing it meant something in the machine had lied to you. On the 4th lap, going into the east sweeper at 162 miles per hour, the temperature on the 3rd coolant loop crossed its critical threshold, and the engine management system executed an emergency torque cut. The car snapped sideways. Marco counter-steered with the reflexes of someone who has practiced this exact scenario several thousand times. He brought the speed down far enough that when the car met the tire barrier at the end of the runoff zone, It was going 41 miles per hour instead of 162. He broke his left wrist and tore his right shoulder. He was sitting up and talking when the medical team reached him. Grant was on the phone with the company attorney before Marco's car had fully stopped. The report Grant submitted to the board 6 hours later was thorough and convincing. The failure had been traced, he wrote, to a substandard brake component sourced from an outside vendor. The documentation listed the vendor. It listed Pete's Automotive. Pete received the formal legal notification the following morning. Liability claim for $4,700,000. Pending court order to freeze business assets. His voice on the phone was the voice of a man trying very hard not to sound like what he was. 60 days from losing everything he had built over 20 years. Reed drove to the garage. He sat across from Pete at the workbench and said, "I need to tell you something I've never told anyone." He told Pete about Ashcroft, about the position he had held as chief safety engineer, about the coolant loop flag, about Maya. She had been a test driver for the development program, not a professional racer, but a trained engineer who had volunteered for the internal test rotation because she was precise and fearless in equal measure. The accident occurred on a closed course on the 4th lap of a heat test run, when the temperature on the 3rd coolant loop crossed its critical threshold and the emergency torque cut snapped the car sideways at a speed that left no margin. The official investigation concluded, driver error. Reed had known, looking at the data, that it was wrong. He had said so in writing. 6 weeks later, he had been handed the NDA and a termination notice, and a lawyer had explained in careful language that if he spoke publicly, the company would pursue sole custody of Wren on the grounds of his documented emotional instability. He had signed. Pete sat through all of it. When Reed finished, Pete said, "How long have you been carrying this?" Reed didn't answer that. "The NDA prohibits me from speaking to media or legal counsel for the opposing party," he said. "It doesn't prohibit me from entering Ashcroft's facility as a credentialed vendor under an active supply contract." He paused. "Which we still have. So what are you going to do?" "Walk in the front door," Reed said. What neither man knew was that Wren had come downstairs partway through the conversation, heard enough to understand that her mother had not simply died in an accident, and gone back upstairs without either of them seeing her. She lay in her bed with her hands flat on the blanket and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Reed arrived at the Ashcroft Group at 8:15 the following morning. He carried a folder and a handwritten technical analysis on 4 sheets of graph paper. Security called upstairs. He waited. After 12 minutes, Vivian's assistant came down and told him Miss Ashcroft was unavailable. Reed sat in one of the lobby chairs and said he would wait. He had been sitting for 8 minutes when Dana Cho came through the main entrance, badge clipped to her collar, there for her scheduled interview with Vivian. She stopped in the middle of the lobby. She looked at Reed. She said his name, Reed Callahan, not a question. The tone of a person confirming something they have spent days trying to verify. Vivian Ashcroft appeared at the lobby elevator 90 seconds later. She had come down herself when her assistant reported that Dana Cho was in the lobby, and someone she had apparently recognized by name was also there. Vivian looked at Reed. She looked at Dana, then to Reed. Conference room 2. 5 minutes. The room had a glass wall facing the internal corridor. Grant Holloway was already inside with 2 senior engineers and Vivian's legal counsel. Reed walked in, set the folder on the table, and remained standing. Grant said, "This man has no standing here." Reed did not look at Grant. He opened the folder and set the first document on the table. The thermal analysis, 4 pages of handwritten calculations, with the failure threshold circled at the bottom of the 3rd page. Beside it, the printout of the anonymous email, timestamp visible in the header. 72 hours before Marco Vega's crash. One of the senior engineers picked up the analysis and began to read. His expression changed the way a person's expression changes when they are reading something that is restructuring their understanding of a situation they thought they understood. 3rd loop, Reed said. Thermal load at 143 degrees Celsius. Emergency torque cut initiates. Car loses stability at any speed above 90 miles per hour. The engineer looked up. That's exactly what happened. The room went quiet. Reed looked at Grant then. Directly. For the first time since the day he had been walked out of this building, he was in the same space as Grant Holloway and had something in his hands that Grant could not take away. Mr. Holloway. His voice was level. Would you like me to read from the internal technical report dated March 14, 2017? The one you deleted from the company server in 2019? I have the original. No one spoke. Grant opened his mouth. Closed it. He was a man who had spent decades knowing exactly what to say, and he was looking at Reed Callahan and calculating whether there was anything left. Vivian, standing at the head of the table, was looking at Grant with an expression Reed had not seen on her face in any of their interactions. She was watching her technical director fail to speak, and something in her face was going very quiet and very certain. Reed picked up the folder. Miss Ashcroft, you have 37 vehicles from the current production line with the same coolant architecture as the prototype. Every one of them has the same unresolved design fault. He headed for the door. Your legal team can reach Pete Granger directly regarding the supplier dispute. He had nothing to do with what happened to your test driver. He stopped. Did not turn. You have 48 hours before Dana Cho publishes whatever she's already found. I thought you should hear it from someone who was there first. He left. Dana came to the garage that evening after 9, when the last car had been picked up and Pete had locked the main bay. Reed was at the workbench, not working on anything. Just sitting. She set a folder on the bench. Inside was the termination documentation from Reed's separation from Ashcroft, sourced from public filings, and 2 former employees who had agreed to speak on background. Reed picked it up and read it. He got to the 3rd page and stopped. The signature authorizing his termination was not Grant Holloway's. It was Thomas Ashcroft's. Reed set the paper down. He looked at the surface of the bench for a long moment. Did you know this when you came here? No, Dana said. I found it this afternoon. Reed was thinking about Thomas Ashcroft, who had died of a stroke in his office 4 years after Reed's termination, 3 months after Vivian had taken over. Reed had met him twice. Both times, Thomas had said safety engineering was the conscience of the industry. If I flagged the coolant fault, Reed said, it went to the Executive Safety Committee. Thomas chaired that committee. Then why did he sign the termination? Reed stood up and went to the far end of the workbench. From a drawer, he took a padded envelope, not the one at home, but one Pete had passed to him years ago without quite understanding what it was. Maya had left it in the car the day she drove to the test track, addressed to the facility safety office. He had read it once and put it away. He handed it to Dana. She read it slowly. When she finished, she looked up with the face of someone assembling something they wished they hadn't found. Maya's letter was addressed to Thomas Ashcroft, dated the morning of the day she died. She described 3 anomalies from the previous week's test runs. A heat warning, she had been told, was a calibration error, a steering pull that appeared only on the 4th lap, and a discrepancy between the post-run data reports and her own recorded notes. She had written, in the careful language of an engineer, I believe there is an unresolved structural issue with the 3rd coolant loop that poses a direct safety risk to test drivers. I am requesting a formal review before any further runs. Thomas received this, Dana said. He read his emails the morning they came in, Reed said. Dana closed the folder. He signed your termination, but he kept Maya's letter somewhere. Grant couldn't delete it. And he died before he could do anything with it. Reed was quiet. I need to talk to Vivian Ashcroft, he said. Not as a vendor. He sent the message to a number Dana provided. The reply came in 4 minutes. When and where? She came to the garage at 10:30, alone, driving herself. She stood in the open bay door and looked at the space around her. The tools on the pegboard, the engine on the stand, the coffee machine Pete had owned since the early 2000s. Then she looked at Reed. He told her everything in order. The position he had held, the safety review, the 6 weeks between filing the complaint and being handed the NDA. Maya, the accident, the official conclusion of driver error, what he had known the conclusion to be when he looked at the data. The 3 years in Pete's garage, Thomas's signature on his termination notice, and the 3 weeks between Thomas receiving Maya's letter and Thomas dying at his desk. Vivian sat through all of it without interruption. Her hands were flat on the workbench in front of her. He could see, toward the end, that her jaw was set in the particular way of someone using muscular effort to keep their expression from doing something they don't want it to do in front of a person they barely know. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father got a letter from your wife the day she died. And 3 weeks later, he was dead. He didn't fire you because he agreed with Grant. He fired you because he was trying to protect you from something and ran out of time." Reed had reached this conclusion himself about an hour earlier. "I don't know that for certain," he said. She looked at him directly. "I'm going to find out." She went back to the Ashcroft building at midnight. In a folder of administrative records not reviewed since Thomas's death, she found a handwritten note in her father's hand, addressed to Edmund Carr, a founding board member who had been Thomas's closest colleague. It said, "Edmund, if something happens to me, find Reed Callahan. Do not let Grant manage this." Vivian sat in her father's old office, with the note on the desk in front of her, and did not move for a long time. She called the board meeting herself at 7 the following morning, with no prior notice to Grant. She used the emergency convening authority in the company charter, which she had never used before. She sent notification to all 11 board members at 6:15, and to Grant at 6:50, 5 minutes before the session was set to begin. She told security to admit Reed Callahan without delay. Grant walked into the boardroom at 6:57 and found Reed already seated at the presentation end of the table. He stopped in the doorway. Something moved in his face the moment in which a man who has been running a particular game for a long time understands that the game has ended and has to decide in real time how to respond. He came in and took his seat. Vivian opened, without preamble. "We're here because the technical failure responsible for Marco Vega's injury and the supplier liability claim filed against Pete Granger's business are not what they were reported to be. Mr. Callahan is here as a technical witness. You will hear him out." Reed presented the evidence in the order he had assembled it. The thermal analysis, confirmed by an independent engineer Vivian had brought in at 5 in the morning, who had reviewed it and stated in writing that the failure mode described matched the Marco Vega incident data exactly. The IT log, pulled the previous evening, showing that a file designated Internal Safety Review, GT Series, March of 2017 had been permanently deleted from the company's server in 2019 by a user account registered to Grant Holloway. The email from Maya Callahan to Thomas Ashcroft time-stamped the morning of her death, with the read receipt showing Thomas had opened it at 7:22, and the original prototype development reports showing that the coolant loop vulnerability had been documented, flagged, and then listed as resolved in a subsequent report that contained no engineering data to support the resolution. Grant waited until Reed had finished. Then he stood and said, "This is a coordinated campaign of character assassination by a former employee, operating under a documented history of emotional instability, following a personal loss." The NDA he signed. Reed did not raise his voice. He did not look at Grant. He looked at the 11 people at the long table, board members who had known Thomas Ashcroft, and who were looking at the documents in front of them with the expressions of people encountering a version of a company significantly different from the one they thought they had been living in. "The NDA kept me silent," Reed said, "but my wife spoke. 8 years ago, to the father of the CEO sitting in this room. She wrote to him the morning she died. She told him exactly what was wrong with that car, and exactly what it would do to whoever was driving it. The question I would like the board to consider is why none of you ever read that email." The room was completely silent. Edmund Carr, 71 years old and the last surviving founder of the company, had not spoken since the meeting began. He placed both hands on the table and pushed himself slowly to his feet. He looked at Grant. "Leave this room," he said. "Right now." Grant looked around the table at 11 faces and found none of them useful to him. He left. The independent technical review took 6 hours. The engineering firm confirmed the coolant loop fault in the prototype and determined that the same unresolved configuration existed in 37 vehicles currently in the Ashcroft production line, 3 of which had already been sold to private buyers. Vivian issued the recall order before the firm had finished writing its official report. The cost estimate, drafted by her chief financial officer that afternoon, ran to 9 figures. She approved it without changing a number. While that was happening, Vivian's IT team, following the trail opened by the server log, found something Reed had not anticipated. Over 3 years, data packets containing proprietary design specifications had been transmitted at irregular intervals from Grant's workstation to an encrypted external address. The volume and pattern suggested a systematic transfer of Ashcroft's core engineering documentation to a third party, almost certainly a competitor. By the end of the day, the company's internal counsel had identified 11 distinct engineering programs whose intellectual property had been compromised. When the federal investigators arrived at the Ashcroft building that afternoon, Grant was in his office with his attorney and did not seem surprised to see them. He asked one of them whether he could finish his coffee. They told him he could. Edmund Carr found Reed in the ground floor corridor after the board voted to formally suspend Grant and authorize the federal disclosure. He was carrying a padded envelope. Old, the paper yellowed at the edges. He held it out. On the front, in Thomas Ashcroft's handwriting, was a name. Reed Callahan. Reed looked at it for a long moment. Then he took it. Inside was a copy of the original March of 2017 safety report, printed on paper and hand-signed by Thomas as the Executive Safety Committee chair. And beneath it, a single handwritten page. Thomas had written, "If you are reading this, I failed to do what I should have done before events overtook me. What happened to your wife was not driver error. The report that said so was produced under circumstances I did not fully understand until it was too late. I am sorry. I am trying to correct it. I am slower than I should be, and I know that." Reed stood in the corridor and read it twice. He folded the page carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. 8 years of silence settled in his chest and sat there, lighter than it had been when he walked into the building that morning, and heavier in a different way that he would not be able to name for some time. Vivian was given her own copy of the original report and her father's letter at the same time. She read it alone in the office that had been his, the door closed. No one saw her cry. When she came out, her eyes were red and her decision had already been made. The recall would proceed. The federal disclosure would proceed. Maya Callahan's name would be entered into the corrected accident record as the engineer who had identified the fault. The board did not vote on these things. She informed them. She found Reed in the corridor a few minutes later. She stopped a few feet away. Then, "What was her name?" "Maya," Reed said. Vivian nodded. She looked at a point past his shoulder. She tried to stop it. Before it happened, she brought her eyes back to him. "I want her name in the official record. The corrected one, not as a footnote, as the person who identified the fault." Reed looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said. It was quiet between them. Then Vivian said, "The board has asked me to offer you a consulting position. Independent, contract-based. One condition," Reed said. "Full technical transparency with an independent audit committee. No internal gatekeeping on safety reviews." "Done," Vivian said. "I wrote that requirement into the proposal myself." He picked up the folder he had set against the wall and walked toward the exit. "Mr. Callahan," Vivian said. He stopped but did not turn. "I'm sorry about the receiving entrance comment. I didn't know who you were." "No," he agreed. He opened the door and went out into the afternoon. The NDA was formally voided 3 weeks later. That night, Reed told Wren what had happened at Ashcroft, what her mother had done, what her mother had written on the morning she died. Wren listened without interrupting. At the end, she said, "So Mom already knew it was dangerous, and she told them, and they didn't listen." "Yes. And now they fixed it." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Then she did fix it," Wren said. Just later, Reed had sat with that for a long time. On a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the board meeting, Vivian Ashcroft drove herself to Pete's garage. She came alone, in jeans and a light jacket, and stood in the open bay door looking in. Wren was in the driver's seat of Pete's old Volvo wagon, practicing clutch and gear shift under Reed's direction, focused in the manner of a person taking a test she has been studying for. She did not immediately notice the woman in the bay door. Reed saw Vivian. He looked at her for a moment and said nothing. His way of leaving a space someone else could choose to enter, or not. Vivian stepped into the garage. Ren looked over. Hi, Vivian said. Are you here about the work thing? With my dad? Sort of. Vivian sat down on an old wooden tool chest near the wall. She had not been invited. It was the kind of choice you make when you have decided to be somewhere and mean it. Ren practiced the clutch 3 more times, each attempt smoother. On the 4th, she got the gear, and the Volvo rolled forward 2 feet and stopped cleanly. Better, Reed said. I'm learning so I can fix the car myself when something breaks, Ren said over her shoulder. Boss says, if you know how something works, you don't have to be scared of it. Vivian looked at Reed's back. He did not turn around. That sounds right, she said. Ren climbed out and went to find Pete. Reed wiped his hands on a cloth. You didn't have to come out here, he said. I know. I wanted to see if the kid was okay. Reed looked at the empty driver's seat. She's good. She always has been. Vivian reached into her jacket pocket and set something on the workbench. A set of keys. The GT prototype, she said. After the re-engineering. The corrected version. First proper test run is next month. I thought you might want to be there. He looked at the keys without picking them up. I'll think about it. Vivian stood. I know you didn't come back to Ashcroft for the job or the money. You came back because it was the only thing left that could be done for her. Reed said nothing. From the back of the garage came Ren's voice. Bah. Come look at this. Reed turned. He walked past Vivian, and then said, without slowing down, you can stay if you want. Vivian picked the keys back up and followed him. Outside, the morning went on being ordinary. Somewhere down the block a car started on the first try. The sky was the kind of clear that comes after a long gray stretch, when the light returns, and everything it lands on looks like it has been there all along, waiting to be seen.